Right, we're going to kick off the session now. So we've got an hour of data protection with lots of useful information from a theory point of view and from a practical point of view. Can everybody see and hear see the screen and hear me okay? Let me know if you can't. Just if you want to put it in the chat box or the question box, let me know if there's any problems. That's great. We've got Paul on the line. Paul, do you want to say hi?
Hello everybody, nice to have everybody here.
Great, brilliant. Well, just to give you sort of a backdrop to what we're talking about today, we talk about data protection, and it's quite a hot topic at the moment due to the new general data protection regulations that are coming into force in May of next year. We've got Paul, who's joining as an expert today as part of our economic exchange events, and these are free events that we run throughout the year as webinars to provide sort of knowledge and insight about the work we do, but also the selected partners that we work with to help support our non-profit clients. So the purpose of this webinar is really to help you understand the improvements you might need to make to data collection, your contact preference processes, your internal data management practices, and data compliance. So, as I say, we'll be talking about theory as well as the practical aspects. The reason we actively get involved in this topic and why it's important to us is that we actively work with non-profits to help them develop their management processes, implement a CRM system using Salesforce to manage all of their contacts and their correspondence and interactions with those contacts, and help them really sort of report on performance. So it is data compliance is very much coming into its own with a lot of clients that we work with, and that's why we've made this a topic specifically of today. So we will be providing the PowerPoint after the webinar, and also this webinar is being recorded, so we will be able to circulate that as well, and it'll be downloadable from our website if any of your colleagues want to see it as well. So I'm going to hand over to Paul to kick off the session to talk through the theory and what is actually happening in terms of data protection and some of the things you need to think about. Paul, over to you.
Okay, thanks very much. So as Heather was saying, do stick your questions in the question box. We'll try and answer them as we go along if you've got any. But if we can't answer them as we go, you can always email in afterwards, and we'll do our best to tell you what we think, what we hope we understand about these data protection things. What you've got on the screen at the moment is your small print for today. I'm not a lawyer, so occasionally the law gets more complicated than I'm able to understand. Also, of course, it's worth saying that the guidance that we're expecting to have on the general data protection regulation is not coming through as quickly as one might like, so there are some uncertainties about it, so just take what I say with a small pinch of salt. Now, one of the ways that you can communicate back with us is by completing polls. So you now have on your screen a very quick poll. If you could just select one of these, I can see how many votes come in. I don't know who's voting which way, but it would just be useful to know how much background people already have. So that's about a third, nearly a half of you have voted now. If the rest can find the right place to do it, we're up to 3/4. This is good. Anybody else? Oh yeah, still coming in. Votes still coming in. There's about 20 of you there, but so there's a few still to come. Are you going to have a go, or shall we call it a day there? I don't want to spend too much time on these, but it is useful for me to know what's going on. Okay, I think we're stuck on 80% there. I'll share the results with you now. So as one might expect, we've got a majority, almost a majority, have a vague idea or know nothing at all, and some people have a good idea. So hopefully by the end of today, you will have a lot more of an idea of what's going on. Okay, so I'm going to start from a fairly basic starting point, just to make sure that we don't leave anybody behind. Alongside the new EU General Data Protection Regulation, there have been recent public concerns over fundraising practice, and since this affects a lot of organisations, quite a lot of what we're talking about today is to do with the way you contact people and what you can and can't do and what you have to do. A lot of this stemmed from, not directly from GDPR, but from the recent enforcement action and public statements that the Information Commissioner has made, and I'm sure you've heard some of those or seen them in the sector press. There's also, since last July, we've had a new fundraising regulator who has started issuing guidance, and as a result of these, a lot of charities are reviewing their approach to fundraising and other marketing at the moment. The GDPR brings in some changes. It's not a massive, it's not throwing everything out and starting again from scratch. It's an evolution of what we've got at the moment. And one of the things that it does bring in is change on the rules to consent, which of course we'll be looking at. And the important thing is that it comes into force on the 25th of May 2018. So we've got less than a year now to get ready, so that on start day we are actually compliant. We're in the transition period now, so there isn't any kind of grace period after May next year. And of course, the other thing that you're all going to be concerned about is good practice. So we're trying to see what is actually the best practice at the moment, so that everybody keeps up to date with that. Data protection, taking it right back to the basics, it's called data protection. It's not really about protecting data, certainly not for its own sake, it's about protecting people. So the starting point that I'm sure you're all aware of is that data protection comes into play whenever we hold information about people. And our most important task there is to protect these people from any harm that might result through our mishandling their data in any way. And that boils down to two main areas: security, keeping information in the right hands, and good quality data, so that we're not making mistakes with people's data, not having insufficient data, and so on. I'll say a little bit more about these in a minute. The second thing, which is possibly more important for what we're talking about today, is that data protection came in when we started using computers and doing things with people's data that they didn't necessarily expect us to do or want us to do. So the second aspect of data protection is about privacy and choice. So making sure that people know what's going on, and to an extent involving them in the decision. They don't always have a choice, but quite often we have to give people a choice in what we do with their data. And then the third and final aspect of data protection is about individual rights. People have, for example, the right of subject access, which means they can come to you and say, I want to know all the information you hold about me, and with some limited exceptions you would have to tell them that. People also have the right to opt out of direct marketing, which is a key thing that we'll be looking at today. And people have a right to compensation if you harm them in any way by the way you process their data or look after it. So there's some quite important individual rights in there that we have to understand. Now, the Data Protection Act, as we have it at the moment, doesn't say it's about protecting people and about privacy and choice. Instead, what it says is that your fundamental responsibility in terms of data protection is to comply with the 8 data protection principles. And I hope you are all aware of what the principles say, because you have to make sure that your organisation, whatever it does, complies with the principles. So the things I was talking about are in here. Security, data quality comes from principles 3 and 4. The bits about transparency and choice and involving people and privacy come out of principles 1 and 2. Principle 6 is about data subject rights and so on. Now, GDPR essentially has the same principles. The only changes in the principles are the principle 3 slightly changed, so that instead of saying not excessive, it says limited to what's necessary. There's a big emphasis in GDPR about minimizing risk and making sure that you really justify what you're doing with people's data. So that's the only significant change to the principles, although the way it's structured is that principle 6 about data subject rights and principle 8 aren't actually listed in the principles. The content is still there elsewhere in the regulation, but in the principles there are just these 6 under GDPR. Almost no change from what we've got at the moment. So in terms of marketing, at the moment we have the Data Protection Act, which says that people have the right not to receive marketing. And the Data Protection Act also says that we have to comply, whatever we do has to comply with one of the Schedule 2 conditions. And the Privacy and Electronic Communications regulations means that we have to think particularly about marketing by electronic means, because there are additional rules there, most of which end up meaning that we need consent. So I'm just interested in, no, I don't, I was going to give you another poll, but I'm not going to give you that one. I'm going to give you this one. I want to see what you think so far about the change that GDPR is going to bring in. So which of these do you think is going to be the main thrust of what I'm saying about marketing under the new regulation? I can see people thinking hard. We're over half now. That's good. We're getting close to 2/3. Yeah, good. Any more? Yeah, still coming in. Anybody else going to? Oh, yeah, good. Some more people having a go. Oh, we're up to 91%. Can we get to 100? Maybe not. Let's call it a day there, and that's pretty good. And so the results of that. So 2/3 of you think that marketing will only be possible if people consent. A quarter think it may be possible without consent, and others less sure. So that's interesting, because what I'm going to say essentially is that the second option, that marketing may be possible without consent, is where I think the answer lies. And this is really important, because I think there's been quite a lot of panic really about what the new regulation is going to say, and it's not necessarily spot on in terms of what the regulations are going to require us to do. If we look at the current Data Protection Act, I said that you have to comply with conditions for fair processing under the Data Protection Act. Everything you do has to comply with one of the 6. The 4 in the middle, let's worry about them here, because they mainly apply to things where there's a kind of a solid legal basis for doing things. But whenever we want to do something like marketing, we're almost certainly looking at either condition 1, which is consent, or condition 6, which is called the legitimate interests condition. So is it necessary for your legitimate interests without overriding the rights, freedoms and legitimate interests of the data subject? And if it is, then you have a legal basis for your processing, and you can do it without consent. So these are either or. You have to meet one of them. You can meet any of them, but whichever one you meet, it counts just as much as any of the others. So if you have consent, then you are in the clear, you can do what you want to do, but equally, if it's in your legitimate interests, then you don't need consent. And that's the current situation. So the only thing that kind of changes that is that the Privacy and Electronic Communications regulations, when it's talking about marketing by electronic means, gives you some situations where it says explicitly that you do have to have consent. And those are where you are wanting to market by phone to a number that's on the telephone preference service, you need consent. But if the number is not on the telephone preference service, then technically you don't need consent for marketing. Marketing by email or text message, rather confusingly, it says you need consent unless you're marketing similar products or services to existing customers. And the guidance from the Information Commissioner has been quite clear that they really mean customers. So there has to be some kind of commercial transaction. So if you're running a paid for event and people come on that and you collect their email address and you want to market the next year's event or next month's event or whatever it is, or some similar event, no problem. You can do it without consent because they're existing customers. But if they're a donor or a supporter or a volunteer or something, there's no commercial transaction, and so you do need consent for the marketing by email or text message. Now, these regulations are not affected in any way by GDPR, but they are being reviewed separately. And the idea was, I don't know whether they're going to achieve this, but the idea was that any changes brought in on the Privacy and Electronic Communication regulations would come into force at the same time as GDPR. So we need to keep an eye out on that. We don't actually know what the revised regulations are going to say and whether they're going to be any different in this respect from what we've got at the moment. So alongside these new regulations, we've got a question about, do people have to consent specifically to each different kind of contact? And I am going to say quite a lot more about that later on, but basically the answer is yes, I think you do need to look at consent channel by channel. If you try and get a blanket overall consent for everything, then you're probably hampering your ability to contact. But you can if you want to, but I think it's better to get it channel by channel. So, which brings me neatly on to the next slide, actually, because current practice has been under review, not just because of GDPR, but also because of the recent enforcement action that the Information Commissioner took and some of the things that the Information Commissioner herself has been saying. So in the past, I'm not saying that all of these are wrong, I'm just saying that these are all under review. So people have said, oh, well, we've been mailing this person for 20 years, they've never complained about it, so we assume that they're happy with it, we assume that we have their consent. By phone, some people have been a bit cheeky, they've made admin calls, you know, your direct debit, can I just check the details of your bank account? Oh, and by the way, your monthly contribution is a bit stingy, haven't you thought about increasing it? Which is, you know, not actually an admin call at all, it's a fundraising call, and people have been trying to get away with that. Or phoning people up and saying, well, we know you're on the telephone preference service, but we think you're happy to hear from us, without being sure that they have the consent. So that's one thing that people have been challenged on. Email, a lot of people have been thinking, well, we don't actually have consent, but every time we email them, they can unsubscribe, and they haven't done it, so we assume that they're happy with what they're getting. Maybe not, but that's something that's being questioned. Sharing data, one of the things that has been complained about is that it's too vague. If you say, oh, you know, similar organisations that we think you might be interested in, or organisations that are similar in their aims to ours, too vague, not giving people a really good idea about what's likely to happen. And also data matching and profiling. a lot of fundraisers have said, well, of course we analyse our donors and try to decide whether it's worth approaching them again, and we go out and get additional information about the part of town they live. You know, we've got their postcode so we can see whether they live in a wealthy area of town, and therefore they might be more susceptible to giving us a bit more money. And people have been doing that without necessarily telling people that they're doing it, because they assume that it's part of the fundraising process and therefore it doesn't have to be flagged up individually. And all of these things are ones which the Information Commissioner and some other people have been saying, well, actually, we need to think again about these. So this has all been under review, and it all came to a head in December last year when the Information Commissioner published the results of their investigations into the RSPCA and the British Heart Foundation. And they, as I'm sure you know, they got fined for 3 things that the Information Commissioner said they were doing wrong. Now, one of those was data sharing on a massive scale. Millions and millions of people's details were being put into this big pool where a whole lot of the bigger charities shared the data, and then they pulled out the people that they thought might support them. So if you had already supported one animal charity, suddenly you got mailings from half a dozen other animal charities who thought that you might be a good prospect. Or if you'd already supported a medical charity, suddenly you got mailings from 10 other medical charities. And so that was something that the Information Commissioner said, this is wrong, because it has the effect on people of just inundating them with stuff from organisations they've never heard of. Wealth screening and profiling, the thing I was talking to you about just now, where they were looking at the information they had and matching it up with other information. Oh, well, maybe this person would be worth approaching for more money, or maybe that one's not such a good prospect. And data matching, where somebody had given them a name and address but not a phone number, and they went out and got the phone number from somewhere else, a directory or something like that, so that they could try and phone the person. Or, you know, adding an email address where they didn't have one, things like that. And so all of those, the Information Commissioner, what they took issue with was that they were being done without the data subject's knowledge or consent. And this shocked a lot of people, really, because nobody had really considered, none of the fundraising community had considered that there was anything wrong with any of these things. My view, for what it's worth, is that the data sharing through Reciprocate was clearly out of order, because it had really bad effects on people who started getting a whole load of mail that they felt under pressure from. I think the data matching is probably out of order, because if I fill in a form and I could have given my phone number but I didn't, that probably means I don't want to be phoned by that organisation. So, you know, adding it without me knowing, going behind my back in that way, feels a bit unfair. But I think the wealth screening and profiling is the one that people have mostly said, actually, we think the Information Commissioner has overstepped the mark, because what we're actually doing is we're picking people out and being more nuanced in the way we approach them. They may be asked for more money, but equally we may decide they're a poor prospect and we're not going to waste our money on them, or, you know, we're only going to mail them once a year because we can see that they only ever reply once a year, or something like that. So I think the jury is to some extent out. The Information Commissioner hasn't said anything about changing her mind, but I think that might be a little bit up for grabs, that one. The other two, in my view, she had them banged to rights. Anyway, the RSPCA got done for 25,000 and the British Heart Foundation got done for 18,000. And the Information Commissioner said that it would have been 10 times as much if they hadn't been charities. She was being lenient on them because they were charities, and they hadn't been told beforehand that this was wrong. But now that everybody knows the Information Commissioner thinks it's wrong, you won't get the 90% discount if you get into trouble again. However, she has she's penalised another 11 large charities, fined similar sorts of amounts in the thousands of pounds, tens of thousands. But she's now said she's drawing a line under the investigations. She's not going to look into any more charities unless people complain about them. She now expects charities to behave properly and to comply with what she thinks they ought to be doing. So this is, I think, Heather, I haven't got control of this. Oh, I have now. Sorry, just a small technical issue here. So that's what the Information Commission has been looking at. Now, if we look at the GDPR, the new EU regulation, when it talks about marketing, some of the things it says are that you have to be more explicit to people about their right to object to marketing. You have to give a much wider range of information to people than we do at present. And marketing to children is subject to additional restrictions. Now, GDPR says the age is under 16. It can be reduced by the national government to, as long as it doesn't go below 13, and there's an indication that that might happen. I'm not going to say anything about the marketing to children in this webinar because we don't have time to cover everything. So what kind of wider information do we have to provide? Well, the red items here are all the things that are added by GDPR. So the green ones are what we have to tell people already. The minimum things that we have to tell people already is the identity and contact details of the controller. That means the organisation that's using their data, the purposes it's being held for, and who it might be shared with. Now, that's kind of basic minimum, but under GDPR, all of the red items have to be made available to people. So it's not entirely clear whether you have to do, obviously you can't always put everything on the data capture form, but people have to be able to easily find out things like what is your basis? Are you basing it on consent? Is it your legitimate interests, etc.? And if it is your legitimate interests, what are those legitimate interests? How long you're going to keep it for? The fact that they can withdraw their consent, and whether they have to provide the data and what will happen if they don't. So a whole lot of extra information that we have to make sure that it's available to people under GDPR. And then this one. In GDPR, it says that the processing of personal data for direct marketing purposes may be regarded as carried out for a legitimate interest. So what that means is that we go back to the same 6 conditions in GDPR, almost identical, slightly different wording, but the first one is consent, and the second one is, the sixth one, sorry, is legitimate interests. And so what it is saying is that processing it for direct marketing purposes may be regarded as in your legitimate interests, except that, don't forget, the privacy and electronic communications regulations come along with an extra requirement that consent may be required for electronic contact like phone, email and text messaging. So it's all still a little bit complicated, but the basic outcome is why I said that the quarter of you who said that marketing without consent is possible, I think you're right, because GDPR says explicitly that marketing is a legitimate interest, and the implication of that is that you don't need consent. So that's the kind of starting point in GDPR, as long as we take the PCR regulations into account as well. So small differences in the definition, that in GDPR consent has to be unambiguous and it has to be a clear affirmative action. So the individual has to do something. You cannot assume all those things I showed you earlier about, oh, they've never complained, so we assume it's fine. No, it isn't. You have to be able to show that they've actually said, yeah, it's okay. And you have to be able to demonstrate it. So you have to have a record. You can't just tick a box on your CRM system to say, yes, they've consented. You have to be able to say, well, and I'll say a little bit more about this in a minute, but you have to be able to say, yeah, this is when they consented, this is what they consented to, and so on, because you have to have an audit trail that people have consented. We've still got the fundraising preference service, although it's been toned down a lot. It's not been finalised yet. It was supposed to cover fundraising. They've said it will cover all marketing, but it'll basically be a mechanism for people to exercise the right that they already have under the Data Protection Act and that they will retain under GDPR, which is to tell any organisation they don't want to hear from you. And it'll allow people to go online, select the one they don't want to hear from, click a box, and then the charity will be informed, and then you have to follow through on that and make a record that they don't want you to contact them unless they decide to get back to you later and change their mind. So that's what we know about the fundraising preference service at the moment, much less onerous than we thought it was going to be. One of the difficulties with direct marketing is that the Information Commission, the ICO guidance, says that it's not just fundraising, it's not just commercial promotion, it's all promotional material, including material promoting the aims of not-for-profit organisations. And that any message which includes some marketing elements counts as marketing. So if you have an e-newsletter that is 90% news, but at the end there's a little bit saying, oh, and by the way, if you like what we're doing, this is how you can support us, then that newsletter, according to the Information Commissioner, counts as marketing. Now, I'm not sure how much I agree with that. I don't know, you can make your own mind whether you agree with it, but that's what the ICO says, that if there's any content that is at all to do with marketing or promoting your aims, then it makes the whole communication count as marketing. I know that we haven't got much time, and I want to leave enough time for Heather to talk about economic change and how they're approaching these issues. So I'm going to kind of draw together some questions that come out of this for me. So it seems to me that the balance is shifting. In January, the ICO, the Information Commissioner, gave a speech at a big conference in Manchester that some of you may have heard about, where she was basically saying, if you want to do any marketing, you need consent. And a lot of people jumped up and down and said, no, that's not what GDPR says, as we've seen. And a lot of lawyers piled in and said, no, we agree, the law doesn't say that you need consent. It seems to me that the Information Commissioner may be edging back from that, because the fundraising regulator and the Institute of Fundraising and various other people have all come out and said, no, legitimate interests is okay. But it's still not clear where the Information Commissioner is going to draw the line. We don't know whether consent has to be an opt-in or can an opt-out do. You know, this is what we're going to do, but tick this box if you don't want us to, and then send the form back or submit the form online. Is that a clear affirmative action? Is that unambiguous? We don't know. Some people think it should be, some people think it shouldn't. Does it expire? The British Red Cross signed an undertaking with the Information Commissioner a year or so ago, which said that if they had consent for telephone marketing and they didn't use it for 2 years, it would then expire. Now, we don't know whether that's going to apply generally or not. We don't know if the Information Commissioner is right that any content on marketing turns the whole communication into marketing material. You know, is it enough if your email says at the bottom, and this is what we do as an organisation? Does that make every single email you send a marketing communication, which has to have prior consent before you send it? I don't think so, but the Information Commissioner's definition could mean that. So we don't know when providing information becomes promotion of the organisation. We don't know whether an unsubscribe is enough. I think it probably isn't, but some people think it should be. We don't know what PCR review is going to say, and we don't know how much we have to tell people on the form and how much we can of all those information things, and how much can be left for a longer statement. So there's a whole lot of stuff that's up in the air. It's not a good time to be making long-term decisions on marketing because of all the stuff that's been thrown in the air by the Information Commissioner, but then along comes GDPR, and by May next year we have to be compliant with GDPR. So we are all having to make decisions now. And the main thing, I think, is that we are going to have to think about situations where we do definitely need consent or where we decide to get consent. Now, some charities are already switching to opt-in, but the ones who have done it, the ones who went ahead, say it does reduce their income. Even though the people they keep are keener, they don't outweigh the ones who didn't opt in but would have supported it. So the RNLI, which jumped in and took the moral high ground, has now come out last week and said, actually, we may have been a bit optimistic about that, and they're kind of regretting it, maybe. So that, you know, it's, as I say, it's a very fluid situation. Now, we know that consent isn't required for direct mail. People have an opt-out if they say don't contact me, and it's therefore best if you give them the opportunity to opt out rather than making them take the effort. But it's still, you still don't need consent. You have to make sure that people know what they're consenting to. It's not just a tick. You have to show when they gave consent, how that, you know, how did they do it? Did they tick a box on your website? Did they tick a box on a paper form? Did they give it to you verbally on the phone? What did they actually consent to? So you have to have an archive, I think, of your past statements, so that if they gave you consent in 2016, you have to know what the statement said in 2016. And I think you have to record, you know, has consent been given and then subsequently withdrawn? Are you going to expire the consent? You know, various other things. There has to, as I said earlier on, I think it has to be channel specific because the rules are different for post, phone, email, text. So I think you need to be more specific about that. And you have to have the ability to suppress people completely. It's not enough, but if people say stop marketing to me, you have to be able to do that. So I think that, you know, there's a whole lot of implications there that people have to work through, and it's definitely not too soon to start thinking about it. If you have, I mean, you've probably thought about it already. And that's the end of what I was going to say at this point, because I think it's time to hand over to Heather to talk about economic change.
Great, thanks, Paul. That's wonderful. So we talked a lot about the principles and the policies that are in development. But with the sort of the May deadline approaching, there are some very practical steps that organisations can start to take to improve data management in general. Now, depending on where you're at as an organisation, what I want the next few slides to do for you is to ask yourself questions, and hopefully if you're in a good place you can tick them all off and go, yeah, we're already well on our way there. Otherwise, what it will do is help you to flag, actually, this is something that we need to start thinking about and doing. And you know, that might be just complying with sort of some of the data protection guidance more generally, as well as some of the things that Paul has brought up today. So I'm going to talk through 4 areas: data capture, preferences, internal management, and data compliance. As I say, what we're talking about here is more the practical approach to how do you do this in reality. So just to recap on the principles again, I'm not going to go through these, but these are the principles that Paul brought up earlier. So what I'm talking about today is in context to these. And so the first question is what is your baseline? Because ultimately, if you're managing people's data, it's got to be possible to do that in an easy and efficient way. So our clients tend to come to us because they are living in data silos. They have information about their contacts in spreadsheets, in their email, their Outlook or their Gmail, in a financial system or payment processing system, social media, you know, disparate databases. They might have a website that captures data about people. They might have a separate events management system that captures data, and then they've got their e-marketing tools. You know, like MailChimp, for example, which all collect different people's data that isn't joined up. And you know, and so you get to this point, well, how do we comply with data protection if we've got people's data everywhere, and we've got no coordinated way to manage it and understand consents and understand what we've done with them when, and to comply with everything. So the ultimate place that you want to get to, if you're not already, is to create a centralized sort of resource or a database which collects everything and integrates into it rather than separate silos. So to talk through that in more detail through the next couple of slides. So the first implication is obviously data capture. So, ultimately you might be capturing data through different ways. Now you might have an online form, for example, which could be an event registration form, it could be a newsletter sign up form, it could be an inquiry form. You might have lots of different types of online form. You might have offline forms, so they could be paper forms, which sort of sit somewhere else. Ultimately, the idea here is that you want to get the data from those forms directly into one CRM, a central repository of information that is accurate, that has quality information in it, that you know is up to date. So one of the things you need to think about is making sure your online forms or any offline forms you have, that data is integrated into a centralized system. And everybody is inputting, so looking at this next box here, that every user, every member of staff you have, every volunteer helps also put data into your system. So you've got one CRM system with the true sort of reflection of your data. And similarly, you might capture information about people through SMS, through web chat, or through social media. And again, if you have interactions this way and are marketing through any of these mechanisms, if people respond to you by any of these methods, how do you then get that data back into the CRM? So what you want to do, it's a practical step, is do an information audit if you're concerned about, well, actually, where does our data come from and how do we manage the silos and make it more centralized, and how do we streamline that? So you want to do an information audit. And so, as I say, that process is understand how you capture data, and as part of that, find out what you ask of them. What information do you capture about people? And then start to think about where you store that information, with the view that you need to sort of create the one core CRM system to collect everything. Just reiterating again on Paul's comments here, are your communication opt-in offers clear? Do people know what they're opting into or opting out of? We sit on the fence still with opt-in or opt-out, but what are they actually, what are you sort of giving them the option to do? That's got to be clear. So it's worth evaluating that as part of your information audit. And as I say, do have one centralized, accurate view of your data. So you might well have a CRM or database as the core central, but is the information in there adequate, up to date, and relevant, or does some of that need to be cleansed and archived? So that leads us on to sort of the next topic, really. So contact preferences. So how do you ask permission to correspond with contacts? So again, this is part of your audit. Go out there and appraise per data capture. How do you ask permission to correspond with people? What communication methods do they prefer? And is consent recorded? So this is what you need to appraise now. Are we doing this? How do we do it? And as you can see from my diagram at the bottom, you might communicate to your contacts in different ways. So you need to do a mapping of this, and you need to say, well, actually, how do we contact people? How do we approach people or push information out to them? Do we do this by telephone? Do we do it by email marketing, SMS, postal, social media, or any other routes that you might do? So how do we push information out? How do we get their permission to do that? How do we understand what information that our customers are interested in receiving? So Paul talked about legitimate interests and customers. So you might, if we look at good marketing practices, my marketing manager is always saying, oh, segmentation, you need to segment your customers and understand who they are and what they're interested in receiving, and, doing more targeted marketing. That's what comes up when people talk about marketing and best practice. So can you actually simplify your messages to different audiences? Do you know, and can you ask them to opt into certain communications that are of interest rather than opt out of anything that they might get from you? So it might be that they, we've seen the situation where somebody actually just wanted to opt out of the particular newsletter, but still wanted to know about the annual conference. And so it's kind of like, well, how do you give people that choice to sort of have selective communication? And the final point on this side is, how do you update contact details and consent and interest over time? So, we would encourage our clients to kind of do an annual review of that, or maybe more regular than that, where you go to them and say, this is the information we have about you. Please can you check if it's correct? If it's not, please can you update it? And then that will update the record. And you need to record when that was updated and what was updated at that specific point in time. So that's what you need to think about in terms of contact preferences. Now, in terms of internal management, these are some of the points that quite often come up for discussion when we run workshops. The first is, who owns and updates stakeholder information within your organisation? So who owns different contacts, and what does ownership mean? An ownership of a contact will have different meanings within your organisation. So first, appraise whether owning of a contact is important or not, and who can update and what did they update. Does it matter if somebody updates stakeholder information? Does that need to be recorded that it was updated, and was certain information overwritten? And if it was overwritten, does the original data need to be saved? So these are questions that you need to ask yourself. The second is, does data need to be cleansed, merged, deduplicated, or managed? Because again, going back to the main point of this conversation is, how can we manage communications, how can we manage data if actually we've got Joe Bloggs in the system twice, and that's a duplicate that hasn't been tracked, and then the preferences aren't against one name but they're not against another. So somebody needs to take ownership to make sure that data is up to date and clean, that there's not duplicates in the system, and that again, it sort of echoes the importance of managing things centrally. The third point is about, do you need security to limit visibility of certain data? So particularly, again, talking about maybe children or working with vulnerable groups, is there any data that needs to have more security around it than other information? The second is, this is coming up quite often now as well, is around equality data and separating that from contact data. So is it important that your equality data about people, like their gender or age or ethnicity, should actually be anonymous and sat in a different object to that of the contact information? Is that something that you need to think about? And that sort of around age, also covers off the situation around young children. The next is to think about, well, what are our business rules, our correspondence tracking? Because as a team and an organisation, you have to have consistency and clearly communicate to your team what is expected. So it's about saying, well, what are our business rules? What should we be tracking? What are the core fields that we need to track about our contacts? And what do we need to record about our interactions with those contacts? What is the expectation of everybody in this team? So you need to think about, what are the business rules to make sure that, again, you retain compliant. And how do you maintain and review quality of data? Who is overseeing this? Who's managing it all? And because we work with Salesforce, quite often there's a Salesforce admin champion within that organisation. So, is starting to sit under their role. Is it that actually a Salesforce admin suddenly becomes, the database manager suddenly becomes the person responsible for quality of data and data compliance? Or does that role sit somewhere else? Does it sit with the operations manager or the operations director? And how do they work together with the person who holds the database? So all of that sort of thought process needs to be put into place. The next question is about tracking history. As I've talked about before, if you make changes within your system that you have, how do you track history on those updates to those fields? And can you within the system that you've got? So that's something that you need to think about. The next is, how do you coordinate and interact with contacts? So as a team, you might have various people that will send out emails to different groups of contacts. So what's important that as a any team member that's involved in correspondence on a mass sort of level or even on an individual level, that there's a clear sort of interaction plan of like, well, actually this mass email is going to be sent about an event on this date, but then we're going to send the newsletter on this date, and that you clearly map out when things are going to be sent to people, and you ensure through that planning that people aren't bombarded day after day with marketing. Like you have a clear sort of campaign plan, if you like, if they've opted in, because what you want is to manage your current contacts well, because what you don't want is more people to opt out if they're already opted in because they feel like they're getting spammed. So it's important to manage your contacts carefully. The final is, how do you archive contact data after a certain period? And again, that's about, well, when do we archive somebody? What does that mean? Again, we're waiting on some guidance around that. But, is it that actively, if somebody has not engaged with you for a certain period of time, would you automatically archive them? So again, that's something else to sort of think about and agree on internally. In terms of data management, just to recap and to sort of help think through these, and I talk about this in context of what we do with Salesforce, but it is applicable to any CRM system really. To recap on those 3 points, with data capture, look at getting integrated tools that integrate with the CRM so you can make sure that your data is input into one centralized system. You need to agree on core fields that relate to consent and preferences, and these should be unified across the team. The third point is around data quality. So make sure that the data you do get in, that you might need to set validation rules, compulsory requirements against some of the fields, and you need to manage duplicates. So I'd say they're the 3 key takeaways for data capture that you need to think about in a practical sense. In terms of preferences, my 4 top tips here are: make sure you track history on these core fields that you've decided. Make sure that you have business rules for the team and how they manage contacts and communicate. Integrate your communication tools with your CRM to show history and analytics. So integrate your e-marketing solution, a web chat facility, and make sure that if people interact that way, that you can see how they interacted and when they last interacted within your CRM system. And build in your either opt-out or your opt-in or opt-out methods should be built into different correspondence. They're the 4 practical steps summarising there. On the final point around internal management, we've got, I think, 6 key points here. So automate, set up automation in your CRM to manage updates to your contact information. So if you want to automatically archive somebody or you want to update their information, can you set up automation so it's not down to manual user error or lack of update? Within your CRM, you want to be able to set security and visibility around data. You want to manage your password policies carefully and think through again, what are our password policies around data. You need to think through who your data quality manager is and what their responsibilities are. Ideally, you should set up a data compliance dashboard. So it's looking at various things in your CRM to say, well, actually, are we compliant? Are the core fields being populated? If they're not, why not? Let's solve that problem. So you need to decide on what, how can we see from within our system whether we are being data compliant or not? Can you update and archive contact information automatically, and can you use the system to help you coordinate marketing activities? So in Salesforce, for example, you have campaigns and you can manage all your campaigns with a campaign calendar. So if you were to track who's sending what email when, the ideal scenario would be that would be all mapped out in your campaigns. The 4th area we're covering, last but not least, is around managing compliance. So here we've kind of got 3 sort of areas to look at. The first is documentation. So some of the documentation that you probably want to pull together from a practical sense is, 1, do the information audit that I talked about, mapping what information is where currently. Get in place a data protection policy and make sure that it's practiced in real life. Look at your data retention policy. So that's how long you keep data, why you keep data, as again, echoing Paul's point, it's about justification of why you're keeping and using data. So the data retention policy builds on that. And the privacy policy and cookie statement should be clearly sort of advertised or promoted or provided within any communication on your website, for example. So they're the sorts of different sort of documentation that you might need to put in place. In terms of quality assurance, building what we said in the last slide, you need to have password protection policies for your systems. You need to have confidentiality statements in place for anybody that's processing or using your data. So that could be within your employee contracts or any sort of users of your system. So it could be freelancers as well, or even volunteers. You need to decide on the data quality indicators that are visible to allow you to see within your CRM system whether you're being compliant. You need to have a nominated data manager responsible for data compliance, and you need to identify data protection champions within different teams who work closely with the data manager to make sure that everything actually, you're as much as possible checking that you're doing what you set out to do. Now, in terms of supporting your team to understand what, all the things that we talked about in this webinar, one is, as we've talked about, have business rules in place, train all your staff on these rules, and also what the indicators are, what will be audited as a result to check whether actually you are being compliant or not, and actually undertake these audits and say, well, look, we're telling you, we're training you now, this is what we're going to be looking at, this is why we need to do it, we're going to be doing an audit for every month for the next 6 months to check that actually you've taken on board the training, you understand what we mean and you're using it, and then you do, hopefully once that audit process is done, everything sort of everybody's moving in the right direction, you can do the audits less frequently. And then, as I mentioned, the other type of team support is helping to coordinate communication diaries across teams. So this is all about managing compliance. So as you can see, all the areas that I've covered do really interrelate with each other, but there are a lot of practical steps that you need to think about in order to sort of make sure that you're on top of data compliance. Now, in order to prepare, there's some good resources on this slide. So it's all about avoiding the fines. Hopefully, none of you would get fined, and certainly around some of those charities that have it, I think it's obviously starts a bit of a panic around people, and people are taking steps, to make sure that they address all the points that I've talked about. But you can find out more about the fines here. So reasons for fines, there's a great blog here that just talks about why they were fined and goes into more detail at what Paul was saying. If you're involved in fundraising, the fundraising regulator has guidance on their website. If you're worried about breaches and people accessing your data, then there's a section here about how to handle data breaches. There's a data protection toolkit here from the ICO, which will help you sort of think through again the practical steps that we've talked about today. And then there's preparing for GDPR 12 steps, and there's a great little diagram there that might be useful when you're working with your teams, perhaps, to show them, what the key sort of elements are. And then there's also a data protection network that you can join. So there's some sort of useful resources. So hopefully, spot on 1 hour, that's been useful for you to just kind of think about, how you need to prepare, and certainly give you some guidance and steps you can take in the run-up to sort of May next year, and as more guidance and information comes to light, you can evolve what you're doing, but hopefully you can get a head start. Is there any other questions before we finish the webinar today?
Before we send people away, can we just do another poll just to see what people think as a result of today's session? Just very quickly, on the basis of what we've said, what do you think, what are you going away with? Is it, are you panicking now, or are you reassured? Just be interesting to see what people think. We've got a third have answered, a half, getting on for 2/3 now. Anybody else going to? Oh, we're up to nearly 3/4. I don't want to keep people longer than necessary, so if you're going to vote, vote now. and then go out and have your vote in the election as well. Don't forget that. Okay, we're 80%. I think. Oh, a few more. Yeah. I think the picture is quite clear now, so I'm going to share that with you. So, on the whole, more than half of you think it's manageable, which is good. I'm glad to hear that. I think it is going to be more onerous for many people, maybe not for everybody. There's a question about the slides after the meeting. Yes, the slides will be made available through Economic Change. So I think, Heather, are you going to send people an email with a link to the slides or something, or it's going to be on your
Yes.
website or something like that? Yeah.
Yes. Well, I'll circulate them on an email.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, so that's interesting. Thank you for that. So now you get a sense of how your colleagues think about that as well, and I'm fairly confident. So as Heather was saying, I'm happy to receive email questions if there's anything that's not been clear, or if you want to follow something up. And there's masses of stuff out there now, so hopefully you'll be able to pick up some of the things that Heather's been recommending as well. But thank you all for listening, and all the best. And I'll hand back to Heather to close the webinar down.
No worries. Thanks, Paul, and thanks everybody for joining. Hope you found that useful. As Paul says, please do email us if there's specific support you'd like, or you have further questions. For those that opted into receiving other things, we'll let you know about the upcoming events. And for those that opted out of sort of engaging in future things, that's no problem at all. Good luck. Hopefully you found this session useful, and yeah, we hope to connect with you again in the future. Thanks so much, everybody. Thanks, Paul, again.
Okay, bye, everybody.
Have a great afternoon. Bye. Bye.